some of the hallucinations I've had on major psychedelics are extreme. I mean, they're things like the interior of a church spire completely lined with screaming mouths, and this, head full of the screaming, or a procession of a New York vision I had once was terrifying, of a kind of marching band, a brass band coming down Broadway, and realizing as they got closer that they were all skeletons with the flesh still rotting on them, playing instruments made from bones, hollowed out bones and bits of viscera and human bodies. I mean, really quite disturbing stuff, that makes you question your sanity.
What is the best book, according to you, apart from your book, that talks about an experience of drug?
Well, I mean, okay, so drug experience is extremely hard to write about. Actually write about what it's like to be on drugs. That's very, very hard.
Why is that?
I think because it's at risk of seeming like so many other experiences, like a dream or an illness, or, intoxication is in a sense very like a lot of other experiences. And yet the fact that it's provoked by a substance makes it different. It makes it culturally different. I think, I'm a great believer in what Timothy Leary said about drugs, which is that their effect is not just their chemistry, it's the setting in which you take it, and it's your attitude as well. And we all know this just from, even people who've never used illegal drugs, from experience of alcohol or even cigarettes or even coffee. The context matters a lot in how you view it. So I think that makes it difficult. It's very difficult not to fall into cliche. That being said, there are brilliant books about the culture of drugs, how people behave, what they do, and the best of them, and the one that I'm the Will character, my younger self, is preoccupied by, is William Burroughs' Junky, which is an absolutely, it remains the best book about subcultures when narcotics are like that, are illegal. Specifically the subculture of heroin addiction and kind of hard drug addiction. What a lot of what he wrote about, because the book is so influential, he created the culture as much as, sort of he reflected it and then transmitted it at the same time. So, I say in my book, or the Will character says that, when I started using heroin, or he started using heroin in London in 1979, the people I was using drugs with then talked as if it had been going on forever, as if this culture had lasted from sort of the Old Testament. It was so, and of course, there'd been hardly any junkies in London up until 2 or 3 years before. I mean, that's partly because of the intensity of illegal drug culture, because it's a secret society, as well as engaging in a kind of anti-religious ritual. It's kind of, you're defying doctors, you're defying priests, you're defying policemen. It's incredibly dense in its turning away from modern. That's what I think makes it fascinating. I mean, the other great book on, probably the best book on using opiates, is quite different, is Thomas de Quincey's Confessions of an English Opium Eater. Again, he was using opium at a time when it was completely legal. So his descriptions of the pains and the pleasures of opium are probably the best actual phenomenological account of how drugs affect your consciousness. Yeah. So I would go for those two. If you were only to read 2 books concentrating specifically on opiate drugs, then it's Burroughs and Dickinson.
And do you remember how did you discover at that time the birth of Buck, Junky?
He was just massively present in the counterculture of the time. And if you go back to the mid-1970s, you know, you think you're only 6 or 7 years after Woodstock. You know, we thought that the hippie culture was way in the past, you know, because we were kids. But of course, it was only 10 years before the full flood of it. And I think the avant-garde still existed then. There was still a thing because there were still taboos. You know, the McLuhan is right. The medium is the message. I can make you little on this Zoom call. I can go on to Google and I can type in man fucking a donkey and I'll see a picture of a man fucking a donkey in about a split second. It'll tell me how many seconds it took to search umpteen thousand images of a man fucking a donkey. So we don't live. The message of the medium is there is no taboo anymore. We live in what Freud called a polymorphously perverse world. But there were still taboos in the 60s and 70s, unquestionably, and there was still an avant-garde. And anybody who was interested in the avant-garde and in subversive or countercultural art and culture knew Burroughs immediately. He came right up at you. The Naked Lunch was still regarded as almost, you know, the equivalent really for the kind of post-war generations of Joyce's Ulysses for the pre-war generations. Once a great work of literature and a work that profoundly unsettled what we would have called straight society in that way. But, you know, I was reading a lot in my mid-teens. I mean, I was reading everything. We didn't have a television. We didn't have a television.
Yeah.
There was nothing else to do. I lived in the suburbs and we didn't have a TV and I didn't have a lot of friends. So, you know, I read almost everything a well-educated person should read by the time I was 25. I mean,
and did you buy the books?
My mother was a big reader.
Okay.
We went to the library. You could get 12 books from the library. Libraries were well financed. They had good stock, even local libraries, because it was a much more book-based culture in those days. And yeah, we bought books. There were enough books around the house. I mean, my parents were not, you know, they were kind of middle-class intellectuals, so they had quite a lot of books.
And what about the movies dealing with drug topics?
I can't think of any film that really quite gets it. They all, I don't know why exactly. Gus Van Sant's Drugstore Cowboy, not bad. I'd give it like 8 out of 10. Something like Christiane F., which I see that they're remaking from the 70s, closer, partly because of its verite aspect, but it trades in absolute horror and degradation. So, you know, that always works. That's always a crowd pleaser. No, I don't find, nothing springs to mind. In actual fact, if you were to ask me for the best drug film, I'd say it's probably a film about alcohol. It's The Lost Weekend. And it's 1940s film noir about an alcoholic. Very famous, very good, with Ray Milland as the drinker. Very famous, actually, as an account of alcoholism, and is brilliant. And as somebody who's been a very heavy drinker myself, it's very accurate. Film doesn't do well with psychedelics. You would think it could cope with psychedelia since it wants to do optical effects. But, you know, take what a mess Terry Gillingham's adaptation of Hunter Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas is. I mean, it just seems silly, all of the kind of, you don't believe they're on acid for a minute. And if you've taken acid, it's really nothing like an acid trip, you know, so I think there's a real problem there. No, I'm not big about film. Film, in a way, because of the kind of slipperiness of the drug experience, film is too literal in that way. It wants to show you what it looks like.
How would you describe an acid trip?
I think for a start, people always misunderstand with the major hallucinogenics what a hallucination is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so people think a hallucination is some sort of visual distortion or seeing an object there that you know not to be there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, we're doing the Zoom call and suddenly a little pink fluffy unicorn comes across the screen, right? And people think, well, was that really there or not? Can I be sure that it was actually there? Or was it just a hallucination? Okay. But if it happens again and then maybe a third time, does that make any difference? Yeah. The truth of the matter is, if it's a hallucination, it's real, right? You really think it's real.
Yeah.
You don't question it. And in thinking it real, so the number of times that I've had hallucinogenic trips with major hallucinogens when I've properly hallucinated, I can count on the fingers of one hand, because it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying because by definition, when you completely hallucinate, your ego is completely destabilized at the same time. You cannot be the person you are, particularly if what you're seeing is extreme. And some of the hallucinations I've had on major psychedelics are extreme. I mean, they're things like the interior of a church spire completely lined with screaming mouths, and this head full of the screaming, or a procession of a New York vision I had once was terrifying, of a kind of marching band, a brass band
Mm-hmm.
coming down Broadway, and realizing as they got closer that they were all skeletons with the flesh still rotting on them, playing instruments made from bones, hollowed out bones and bits of viscera and human bodies. I mean, really quite disturbing stuff, that makes you question your sanity. Most acid trips aren't like that. Most acid trips are, perceptual distortions, feeling funny about space and time, the profound questioning of social convention. It throws you outside of your nexus of conventional social responses completely. You start thinking to yourself, why do I go in that little room to shit? Why do we make love in private? Why are these people driving around in these sheds, these little, huts with wheels on, with a fire on them? What's going on here? And when you're coming up on LSD, it's like amphetamine. It's very exciting and very kind of galvanizing, and you have this rush of ideas and perceptions. But it's not, a paradis artificiel in that fully realized way at all. That's quite unusual.
And do you think that it has really changed your way of writing or reading? That you would have been absolutely not the same writer with those experiments?
Yeah, no, I don't. I mean, they weren't experiments. My problem is I both experimented and I became addicted, and I went on experimenting, and I can't really pretend otherwise. And yeah, I'm definitely a drug writer, no question. I mean, it had a profound effect on me. I mean, I was a heroin addict when I was 17. I was using all of these drugs in my teens, and I went on till my late 30s. I went on for 20 years. It was not a flirtation, but that's partly a choice. It's like those awful American creative writing courses. I do think you should write about what you know, and I think beyond a certain point, when something's been, in a sense, philosophically influenced you, emotionally determined the structure of your life, socially altered your life, because I was in trouble with the police when I was young. It meant I could never have a professional career. I was already, outside the law in that way. Of course it affected me, but I didn't ever manage to, get that kind of narrative of recovering from it that meant I embraced an idea of being straight and being not that. I couldn't do that shit. I mean, so So yeah, I accept the label that I've been very influenced by drugs. Yeah, I mean, by no means all my books are about them. Uh, in some of the novels, you'd be hard pressed to see exactly what the influence is, but yeah, it's there. If it's not drugs, it's a deep engagement with psychiatry, medicine, the kind of abnormal states of mind, what else.
And do drugs like remove in a kind of way fears in people?
Yes, I think that's right. I think they deal with anxiety in all sorts of ways, often in a very perverse way. And one of the great brilliant things about being a junkie is, as long as you got your junk, at least in theory, you're okay. So the absence of junk becomes a category into which all anxiety goes. There is you don't worry about the bomb anymore. You don't worry about dropping dead from a heart attack. You don't worry that your lover will leave you. You don't worry about being arrested. You don't worry about anything except getting your junk. And I think that's true for lots of drugs, more than people realize. I think even a perfectly normal person who has a coup de rouge in the evening and kind of thinks, well, that's what, even she may be actually banishing a huge amount of anxiety just with that ritual. So yeah, definitely. And why not? There's a lot to be anxious about.
Yeah. And what about music? I don't know if you listen to a lot of music, but
No.
Is there an album or a track or a musician that for you have been very important in the drug, the translation of the drug experimentation into a cultural act?
Well, I mean, there are great individual tracks. There are extraordinary drug tracks because the whole feel of the music is in tune with the experience. It's in tune with the subculture. It's in tune with the idea of a secret language that other people don't understand. It's of youth against age. It's of rebellion against conformity. So, of course, it's massively and there are individual tracks that I think probably capture the drug experience better than books or films. The Velvet Underground's Waiting for the Man is perfect. It's absolutely perfect. It captures, that's exactly what it's like. And just as we read Junkie and we became junkies, we listened to Waiting for the Man and then we waited for the man. Or The Only One's Another Girl, Another Planet is a brilliant song about heroin. You get under my skin. I don't find it irritating. You're always played with, but I won't need rehabilitating. It's a kind of hymn to giving way to addiction in that way. And the riff itself, the famous guitar riff, is absolutely, it's like shooting up. That's what, has that kind of oscillating. Do you know the track?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it sort of goes woo like that. All of that stuff. Elvis Costello's Pump It Up is a great speed record. It's about being fucked up on amphetamine. Yeah, I mean, on and on and on it goes. Yeah, I mean, the correspondence between popular music and drugs is just huge. Yeah, but why would you want to sit and listen to that? I mean, why would you want to sit and listen to that? I mean, the problem for our culture is the same as the problem for popular music, which is the guitar band has become classical. It's now like a string quartet. It's been going around. It's been around for so long. And the music is tired. We've also suffered a kind of demographic bouleversement. So there are now more old people than young people. And the old people all wear denim and think that they're into rock and roll. So they fucking killed it stone dead. I'd rather listen to Beethoven personally. I mean, I just find, contemporary, sort of rock music is about as hip as a hip replacement operation in an old somebody my age. And also, the main point is it's rock and roll is fucking. It's rocking and rolling. It's 4/4. It's sexual music. It's not about people who, with the best will in the world, are too old for such behavior. It really, and nor should it be, actually. It's a bit of a mistake. It's a solecism. So I have a nostalgia for that music, but I don't listen to it.
And do you have the feeling that when you took drugs while listening to the Velvet or reading Junky, or you were trying to reproduce the behaviors of those characters in the song or in the book?
Yeah, believed in the validity of the drug experience. I believed that this radical questioning of all social conventions, just like, why'd you do that? Don't do that, and I believe that with its at least apparent hedonism, drug taking short-circuited the pretensions of the straight world. The truth of the matter was they all wanted to be like that. And I've observed that over the years. I mean, there's, talk about drugs and culture. There's something I call drug pornography, which is a lot of culture that looks at the drug experience and as it looks as extreme sexual experience, like a voyeur. And I've experienced a lot of that over the years. I've seen people kind of looking at me in that way, and you always know the drug voyeur because they always say something utterly stupid. Like
what?
Well, they always say, I took heroin once, but I never took it again because I knew I'd become an addict. Well, I mean, that's just bullshit. If you're an addict, you immediately take fuck tons of it. You don't.
But at the same time, maybe you give like a kind of food to the drug voyeur with your new book.
Yeah, like the relationship between rap artists and white.
Maybe a little bit. Did you wonder about it? Did you ask yourself the question?
That's a good question. I hadn't really thought of that, funnily enough. I hope not. I think it's more, I think one of the reasons of using boroughs in the book, because, I gloss a lot of junky in the book, and the Will character is in a discourse with the Burroughs character to some extent. He measures himself by Burroughs. And I think a lot of point about that was to produce a text that was more nuanced in terms of its social understanding of what was going on with drug use, addiction, the psychopathology of it. I hope that's there in the text. And, there are 5 episodes in the book, and there are descriptions of intoxication, of being high, but most of the book is written from the perspective of somebody withdrawing from drugs, somebody sick from drugs, somebody in trouble with drugs. So that's the bulk of the book. The whole framing of the text is withdrawal, fighting it. It's not using. So that's not because I wanted to produce a morality fable either. I couldn't give a fuck about that. It's because I wanted to tell the truth about the experience. And the trouble with being a drug addict is you have to increase the dose. And beyond a certain point, you just can't do that. So there, it's like your need for more goes like that, and your ability to get it goes like that. And this area is suffering. And it just gets bigger and bigger as you go on. My suffering, at the end of my drug using was if possible, greater than my suffering at the beginning. I had more responsibilities for a start. By the time I finished using drugs, when I was nearly 40, I had 3 children.
And was it painful to remember that time of your life?
Yes, definitely. And I think that a lot, in as much as the writing about myself in the third person was an artistic decision to try and a philosophic decision, because I don't really think I'm the same person. I think it's meaningless to think of yourself as the same person. And I think when people say things like, I did this or I did that in the distant past, I mean, I understand what they mean, but literally speaking, that's a lie. It wasn't you. how can it be you? I mean, especially if you're talking about, in my case, a gap of whatever it is, 32 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I also think that the creation of the Will character was because it was too painful to completely identifying it as being me. I literally would have gone through the same torments again. I needed to objectify it to some extent. And actually, I think I found the truth much more through objectifying it. What I found, one of the things in cultural terms that interested me about the book is you'd never read the book really and think this was a very political young man, very politicized. So, in fact, I viewed myself at the time as really quite political, very definitely on the far left. I was involved in political parties, I went to demonstrations. I talked into the night about, come the revolution and all of this stuff. But when I look back on my life emotionally, it wasn't what was important to me. The drugs were way more important. My girlfriends were way more important. There was other stuff going on. All of the politics fell away, and I could see that it was just, it was, I don't know, it wasn't important. It seemed important at the time, and it seemed disingenuous. It would have been dishonest to write about it too much.
Do you regret that? The fact that the political was not that important at the time?
No, I just think I'm representative of most Western liberals. Western liberals want it all. They want the money and they want to think they're good at the same time. and it's, it's what Sartre called bad faith. It's just basic bad faith. And you see it everywhere. Last night, you saw the ridiculous spectacle of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry talking about their suffering as multimillionaires to a billionaire, Oprah Winfrey, in a gated community, with them weeping about their suffering and identifying with those people Frantz Fanon would have called the wretched of the earth. It was laughable, obscene.
Do you think that we live in an obscene world, or that the world is more and more obscene every day, every year?
Yeah, in a way. I mean, if you arrived in any environment and the top species in that environment had destroyed the environment and was literally sitting there in a pile of its own shit, then you'd find it pretty obscene, yeah. And when I walk down the road and I see the people sitting on top of the little fires in their metal boxes, or I see the Amazon packaging spilling out of the dustbins, it looks quite obscene to me, actually, in a way. It does. I mean, which is not to say that I'm repulsed by it altogether. I have to live in it. I'm human too. I have to make something of it. But yeah, I do find it quite obscene in the real sense of something, kind of that affronts me in that way, yeah.
What is your relationship nowadays to drug? Like, are you anti-drugs, or do you still find that interesting that some people experiment drugs, or?
Well, I don't think, I think that taking a drug once or twice may be interesting experience, but taking it 200 times is just a habit. And it just depends how bad the habit is. And you have to be realistic about that. We all have habits. Some habits become so bad they become addictions. I've never been anti-drugs. It's an absurd idea. It's a bit like you can't have a war on drugs. They're an inanimate object. It's like having a war against tables. Doesn't really make any sense. I haven't taken hard drugs, really, not much, since for now, once or twice for kind of whenever it is, since 1999, for 22 years. I admire them from afar. I don't really drink alcohol. I like weed a lot. I've always been a big weed head. I stopped for a long time, but I took it up again about 6 or 7 years ago, and I enjoy it even more than ever, actually. I think it's one of the great drugs.
Is there something that comforts you or that you find reassuring? Like in literature, sorry.
Oh, in literature specifically?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, of course, it used to be Burroughs' Junkie. I literally used to read that book. You know, the Germans have the expression Schadenfreude, laughing at the misfortunes of others. And I'd often reread Junkie when I was in trouble with heroin, and
Really?
think, and it would comfort me because I think, well, I'm not as badly off as he is. You know, I'm not about to shoot my wife. I'm not in jail. I'm not, you know, that would cheer me up. Nowadays, I'm terrible with Schadenfreude. I love it. I like reading books about, you know, explorers.
Okay.
I read quite a lot of them. I just read this book by David Gran that's coming out in France, The White Darkness, I think it's called, or something like that. I love that shit. Give me a man who's voluntarily chosen to go somewhere so cold that his testicles will freeze off, and it'll comfort me no end. I like to lie in bed, nice and cozy, preferably in winter, reading about somebody having a very hard time. You know, I don't have any of that kind of. I think when people talk about comfort literature, they mean easy plots and
No,
kind of.
that's not what I was saying. It's more to like to something that is very, very important for you. That's you know that is a book that could like give you kind of give meaning to life, you know.
Oh yeah, well I mean there's plenty of that, and you know they're by the really good guys. You know, I started rereading for the first time since I was 14 Dostoevsky's The Idiot last week, and you know that's a proper novelist. You know, so I don't bother with much contemporary fiction. I haven't for many, many years. I mean, you know, time will tell whether they're any good. And I don't really want to waste as a writer myself, I don't enjoy it. If I'm going to read any fiction at all, it has to be absolutely classic.
Really?
Yeah. I haven't read much fiction at all since I started writing it seriously myself. I just find it a distraction. I mean, if you write fiction seriously, and I've written a lot of books now, then it's like you're standing on the side of the stage and you can just see how everything's done. You know, the point about reading the great writers is you can see how everything's done, but it's done so well that, and with the really great writers, and actually Dostoevsky is an example, partly because he's in translation, I'm reading him in English. I think I might be closer in Russian. I can't quite tell how he's doing it. I can't quite tell how he's producing the effects. And that, for me, as a professional writer of fiction, somebody is about as comforting as it gets. You know, when I read a contemporary writer, I know what they're fucking doing. Make it new. You know, I have no notion. I'm a writer who believes in making it new, who believes that you know, Kafka said, I cannot read a book unless its writer was driven to write it, had to write it. And you read so much contemporary fiction and you know that the writer was driven to write it because they want to pay their mortgage, or they were driven to write it because they're vain and they want to be in the public eye, and they want to, you know, T.S. Eliot said, you know, art without intellect is just vanity. And that's most of what I see around me culturally. It's just, you know, it's just a waste of fucking time.
Were you absolutely driven to write your last book yourself?
Oh, yeah. Particularly the last few books. I've not become less driven. I've become more driven, particularly since my work took a more experimental turn 10 years ago. I mean, you know, in the late 90s, early 2000s, I was selling a lot. I was, you know, I had a nice, if you say in English, a nice line in satire, in kind of decadence. I could have just kept on doing the same fucking thing over and over again, but I didn't. I did something radically different. So yeah, of course I've been driven in that sense. You know, I'm a naive man that I am. I believe in that shit.
And are you addicted to writing?
I think I was for many years, but I think I'm kind of over it, actually. I'm over it. And part of it is because I see how commodified the book world is really, that it's not the values that it thinks it. You know, I'm old enough now that I've seen editors, critics, writers, time and time again saying that this is the new great thing that's really important, and it's not, you know. And when you see a whole culture do that, you know, I mean, Walter Benjamin rightly identified, you know, nouveauté as the essence of the commodity. And, you know, when you see that again and again, and you in your line of work, you'll see it even more, then you become deeply cynical, and rightly so.
Are you cynical or are you jaded?
Both.
Okay.